Hi, welcome to Beyond Authentic Witchcraft, the Hi, welcome to Beyond Authentic Witchcraft, the meandering magical podcast. I'm Lisa.
And I'm Neil.
And together, this is the second part of our LGBTQIA Queer Pride special return of the podcast episodes. So if you are listening to this and you haven't heard the first one we talked very much about our own personal place within the LGBTQIA plus rainbow people and how that's affected our own practices, where we fit in and where we see ourselves within the magical community and within the queer communities. This episode, we wanted to delve in a little bit more on queer magic and what that might look like, what sort of deities there are, because for some people, they like to work with deities that represent or mirror elements of their own sort of history, their own path, their own journey. And so we're going to talk about that. We've got some amazing book and tarot deck recommendations later on, so make sure you stick around for that. But I guess, Neil, as a chaos magician, you are all about researching and love delving into all sorts of aspects of the nuance behind witchcraft and behind sort of magical practice. So I know very little, only really sort of the Greek and Roman pantheons that I think most witches vaguely know, where some of them have occasionally appeared as different genders or given birth to themselves or whatever sort of weird and wonderful history it is. But there's actually a massive amount of queer culture within the sort of the deities and the myths and all of that. What have you found specifically for this episode, and what have you discovered?
Yeah, I mean, kind of for Pride Month, I've been reading quite a lot of that angle of witchcraft books. Is to do with, different queer deities and myths and practices and where people fit into those practices and things like that. I mean, the thing is that, well, there's different biases to do with these stories. People can interpret them differently, like they might read into it as queer coded, some people don't, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. I mean, when I was reading different books, like some were very different, like they saw that deity as bisexual, and then that one saw them as transgender. And also we kind of project our modern in kind of terms, or identities onto those stories as well, when it might be from a culture that didn't have those labels back then.
I think it's very similar to recently, in recent years, Anne Lister, who was the Gentleman Jack character on the BBC series, had two different blue plaques made. One said that she had identified as trans masculine, as trans male. And the wider lesbian community were very upset by that and said that, again, that was us from a 21st century perspective, putting that label on somebody who never used that terminology, regardless of the fact that terminology wasn't used. And so now her plaque reads lesbian, writer, poet, blah, blah, blah. And so, if that's still happening now with people within our own lifetime, then I guess it's really, really understandable why deities and figures from antiquity, like there must be all sorts of different interpretations around what that sexuality or gender identity meant, or if it was just, if everybody was fluid.
I mean, and there's also the kind of point of, well, some of these things could be like allegorical, they could be like symbolic of someone who's between states, like spiritual and earthly, or life and death, like that could just be like a symbol, in general. but you know, it's I find it interesting just how people can interpret these things differently, and maybe there's some things I'm going to mention where there's someone who practices that kind of pantheon who look at it completely different. So I'm quite open to anyone kind of chipping in the comments going, oh, well, I don't know, you know, if there's this bit in this text that actually points towards this, or I've always seen them as that. So I'm quite open really to, you know.
Absolutely. Please, if you are listening to this or watching this, please do comment, especially if you've been taught that a particular deity or an entity was a very different perspective to what Neil has on it. The only thing I will say, the number one rule we have on our channel is it's a safe space for all, and don't be a dick. That's the only rule. Number one rule above all else is don't be a dick. So you can, by all means, we won't be limiting or deleting comments as long as they are respectful. So feel free to disagree, feel free to raise your own opinions and your own discussions in the chat. Let's do that. I'm all up for that. But please do be respectful. It's really sad that we have to say that in this day and age, but it is very, very important.
But yeah, I mean, I'm bound to get some stuff wrong, and I've actually had to make notes of some names, and I'm gonna get these names wrong, you know. So, you know, feel free to correct me, or just excuse me, you know, because I do a lot of reading. I don't hear these words out loud, so you know, I'll do my best. But
it can't be worse than half the AI voices you hear on adverts these days.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
You know, we'll do our best. And if it's if it's a bastardized pronunciation, apologies. If the deities take offense, they can come and tell us their name. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But I think the most, I mean, who would you say is the most kind of famous gender fluid god or goddess out there? Who comes to mind instantly?
Oh, I really wouldn't know. You've really put me on the spot there. It's been a long time since I've worked with deities. I mean, the standard for me would be, I honestly couldn't tell you. I honestly don't have a particular deity jump to mind in the term of gender fluidity at all. No.
Okay. Everyone all together. Loki.
Oh yeah, of course. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Loki. Yes. You know, I think everyone kind of is familiar, even with the Marvel side, that Loki is known for, you know, his fluidity and his shape, and changed into a woman and was able to give birth. You know, I feel like that's that's one that springs to mind. I think that was, I mean, especially for me it was. But I mean, in the Norse pantheon in general, there is quite a lot of fluidity in gender. There's a lot of cross-dressing and, you know, trickster elements to it. Odin cross-dressed, and he was learned a form of what was known as women's magic at the time, which was Seither. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I consulted several people about it. But yeah, so he was taught Seither. So there was that kind of fluidity in the Norse. I think kind of the most iconic gender fluid symbol in witchcraft is Baphomet, who, you know, symbolizes all, you know, in general, kind of, you know, the mundane and the spiritual, female, male, that kind of mashup, you know. And obviously that comes from kind of Knights Templar and Satanic Panic and stuff like that, but that's adopted as a symbol now. I mean, I've got a lot of Baphomet stuff about, because I just love that image in general. I think another one that is quite famous that kind of escapes people sometimes in the Greek is Hermaphroditus, which
of course, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
My brain did go, hang on, Greek, and I just, yeah, I've got a poorly brain. You have to let me off these things.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, who was originally was the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. And through an event, there was someone, I can't remember her name, it was a nymph anyway, who wanted to be forever joined with Hermaphroditus. and so they merged, and that's kind of, you know, obviously it spawned the word hermaphrodite. I think that's quite. I mean, the Greeks had all sorts of going on. I mean, you've also got pan, which some people mistake for being the root of pansexual. Well, it's not. It's just from the root of the word pan in Greek, which just means all, you know. But it's quite cool, kind of, you know, if someone's pansexual, kind of associating with that image of Pan, you know, this, you know, satyr who just is the god of the wilds, and, you know, is amongst the nymphs, and, you know, all of that. He's quite a kind of sexy character, you know. I was reading about Tiresias in Greek. I think that's how you pronounce it. I consulted various, how do you pronounce these names websites. Tiresias, I think. Tiresias, maybe. Who was like a god of clairvoyance. And he was, I can't remember what it was. I think it was he went into the woods and stepped on a snake and got cursed to live as a woman. And he was a woman for 7 years. I can't remember why it was specifically 7 years. You know, had children, was a priestess. I think actually it got reversed when he went and stepped on another snake or something, which is a, I don't know if it was that easy. People might just be
quite
going
common
around.
in those days, yeah.
People might be going out and stepping on snakes, you know.
I mean, if that still happened today, it would save the NHS an absolute fortune in transgender care. Go walk along and just go and step on a snake and then be able to give birth. It sounds ideal.
I mean, Zeus as well was known for cross-dressing.
Yes.
I was kind of delving into kind of different kind of translations, because, you know, there's many kind of, you know, variations on the different stories. And, you know, there's the kind of talk about how he gave birth to Athena out of his own head. There was a strange story about, I don't know, he was mad with his wife, who was it, Metis. And so he put her inside his belly. But in kind of some translations, belly in Greek is kind of womb. So there's the case of him kind of putting her in his womb. There's quite an interesting kind of, in lots of different takes about if Zeus had those parts, you know. Found that really interesting.
I think from my understanding, there was a deeper understanding of the fact that a god form, a deity, could be anything and everything that they wanted, because they had godlike powers.
I mean, even in ancient Egyptian, there was the tale of, I think it was Set, who gave birth to Horus's child. I mean, it kind of involved some strange situation where Set swallowed some semen on a lettuce, and that made him pregnant. So, you know, you kind of have got the gods all of a sudden being able to give birth, you know. And again, it's kind of one of those things of, is it kind of just allegory, you know, rather than they can shapeshift. But yeah, I mean, I started going down into Mesopotamian religion.
Oh wow, you really did go deep.
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge is very, very muddy, so, you know, there's all kinds of variations as it kind of evolved through time. Gods and goddesses start off with one name, but then they were another name, and it was whether or not they were the same or they were just kind of similar archetypes. Like Inanna was the goddess of war and sexual love and protection of sex workers and women, and Babylonians referred to her as Ishtar. I don't know if that's pronounced right. So she was, she was one of those that kind of, you know, developed or was just a similar sort of archetype. But there is some confusing kind of swapping of pronouns throughout those histories. And apparently there's like an Akkadian hymn that's about her and her abilities to change people's sex. I didn't go far enough to like see if that was still a thing or out there or anything like that. But what I found interesting was when she was trapped in the underworld, it was said by, I think it was the queen of the underworld, Erish Kigel. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. She said, well, no man or woman can come into the underworld to rescue Ishtar. So then there was a being, or I'm not too sure if it was beings, was created that was neither, who was known as a Shushan Amur, and who went down into the underworld to rescue her. And this Erish Kigel got pissed off and said, no being like you, like whether or not that's intersex or trans, can, I can't remember. I think she just cursed them. And so Ishtar is kind of, to make up for that, declared these people as holy people. And then you got a case when Ishtar's temples, gender non-conforming people of that time, were welcomed, and they were known as the Gala, I think. So there were specific kind of worshippers that would go to her temples and be known as the Gala, I think. But I think that, I don't know whether or not that was Sumerian. I get them all confused, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian and all that. But an interesting thing that I found in Aztec was there's a goddess of filth called, I'll try my best, Tlazolteotl. And going back to pop culture, Grant Morrison wrote The Invisibles, which is a very important comic book in chaos magic, which they wrote as a kind of hyper sigil. So in the comic, they put in things to alter their own life. And in the comic, there was a character who was transgender called Lord Fanny, who worked with this particular Aztec god. And then Grant Morrison themselves got into doing chaos magic rituals to do with gender and cross-dressing and things like that. And then manifested in recent years that they're non-binary. So they saw that as a kind of their use of that goddess, their comic, this hyper-sigil thing kind of made them come to this realization that they were non-binary. I was like, ooh, I like that. So yeah, it's cool. But yeah, I'm a bit kind of muddy with Sumerian stuff, but I'm gonna have to look more into it. It's quite cool. So yeah. But I got into looking into Hinduism, and there's a lot to do in their scriptures to do with people changing gender. I mean, I've talked about this with you, how they have a concept of a third gender called Hijra. Yeah.
Hijra. There's I actually know somebody who has a third gender passport, because although she prefers using she, her pronouns, she identifies as Hijra and has that as I say, that third gender recognition on her passport, and was very much into the history and the culture, and spoke very openly about how historically the Hijra were an incredibly important part of the Hindu culture, but how these days they are basically treated and seen as lepers, and very much, put upon and very much treated disgustingly, unfortunately. But go on. What did you discover? Because it would be interesting to hear the sort of historical and magical sort of context.
So there was a goddess called Bahuchara Mata. Again, correct me. Who was the goddess of fertility and chastity, and is seen as the patroness of the Hijra, who originally cursed a man to be a eunuch, and then took pity on him and ordered him to create and build a shrine to her. And so emasculated men, that was their place to go to be blessed by her. There was Lord Rama, who was accompanied into the woods by the Hijra. There's kind of a few things like that where there will be stories about they were surrounded by the Hijra, they were accompanied by the Hijra. There's a lot to do with that. I mean, today I was reading about the Hijra and their celebrations and their rituals.
Is it worth actually sort of defining for people that might not understand what third gender in Hijra means? Because from my friend's perspective, largely the Hijra were assigned male at birth, but would in some cases undergo either chemical or medical castration to become what we would have referred to as eunuchs. Sometimes Hijra will identify as the closest thing in Western society would be to trans. So some Hijra people will go from being assigned male at birth to undergoing surgeries to become closer to a female bodied person. And so they would undergo certain surgeries and hormone replacement like any other trans woman would, or can if they choose to. But for other people within the Hijra culture, they may not have any medical or surgical treatment at all, and they may live their life as a Hijra person completely without any medical intervention, the same as any other person on the planet is entitled to do. But by identifying as part of the Hijra community, it is accepted that they wear more feminine dress. It is accepted that they are very much, they have a place within society. However, largely these days, that place is seen as being beggars. And being, it used to be that at a very large opulent wedding, you would invite members of the Hijra community to bless your wedding, and you would give them a space at the top table, or one of the top tables. You would treat them as an honored guest. You would perhaps give them old clothing that was no longer needed. You'd make gifts and offerings, very much like witches in sort of ye olden Celtic days, before witch trials. Very much like you'd give your local witch your cast off clothing and things. One of the things that Pratchett used to talk about, and historically they were seen as good luck, and so you would want them to be at your wedding, at a birthing ceremony or naming ceremony. You would want them to be part of that, to bless your union and to bless your child. Unfortunately, as society moved on and as more Western sort of beliefs became more prevalent in that region, it was then seen as an embarrassment for the Hijra. And increasingly, Hijra would turn up at a wedding uninvited, unannounced, and demand to be paid to leave that wedding. Otherwise, they would cause a massive scene. They would, they unfortunately, at least in the way the public view them now, they see them as an embarrassment. They see them as hyper sexualized. Some of the Hijra work as sex workers, but a lot of them will turn up at events and threaten to, expose themselves and do all sorts of very highly inappropriate things at a wedding in order to be paid off. And that cultural shift has really happened in the last sort of few decades, so fairly recently, where they've gone from being, a group that you wanted to bless you to being a group that you would give a couple of $100 to, get rid of. And as a community, as that perception has changed, those people have become some of the most impoverished people, and some of the most desperate people. And so again, going from what my friend would tell me, some horrific stories and things, but largely the Hijra don't want to be, turning up and causing problems. But if that's the only way that they can make an income, if that's the only way they can get any money to survive on the streets, then that's kind of where they've been pushed to almost. And it's really sad. And if you watch a lot of travel logs from India, quite a lot of times you'll see people, the standard white tourist with the camera in a rickshaw, and you'll see them going about various cities, and you'll see Hijra approaching, asking for money, demanding money. And quite a few times that's kind of, unfortunately these days, that's the first time that a lot of Westerners ever come across the Hijra culture. But historically, they were an incredibly fascinating and very, very important aspect of the Hindu culture. And as I say, there were temples raised to them, and they were revered. And it's probably a bit of an echo of how society as a whole has shifted towards people who are gender non-conforming, that is, the experience these days. And certainly my friend the reason I know her is that she was in the UK as an asylum seeker, because as a Hijra person, she was incredibly inhumanely and poorly treated in some of the most horrific ways imaginable. And several of her friends lost their lives purely and simply because that's how they identified. So but it's really fascinating. When you said to me, "Oh, have you heard about the Hijra?" I was like, "Yes." How has your research got to that? But no, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, because I'd learned about how they have an 18-day festival once a year, which is associated with Krishna, who changed into a woman because there was someone called Aravan who, after taking part in a war and was going to sacrifice himself to Kali, wished to be married before he died. And so Krishna turned himself into a woman so they could get married. And so in this festival, there's lots of different things that happen during these 18 days, but basically it kind of ends up being where the Hijra, dress as Aravan's wife, and kind of things come to an ending where it's kind of symbolic of Aravan being released. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but when I was looking into that, and because the Hijra they've got quite an emphasis on people going from male to female, I was looking into, there is actually tales of female going into male. There are stories like that. Ela, her parents wanted a boy, and then through prayer, turn into male. And then there was some, I think it was, yeah, there was something about this forest where she went to this forest as a man, and then this forest made her turn back female. And then there was a kind of deal made with a god who let her live as male on and off or something. I think it was, yeah, every alternate month, I think. So there was them. And then Shikan in a D, who was, I think it was, or was it the other way around? Oh, that was it. Yeah, it was them, who lived as male. And then when they were found out when they married someone, found out that they were a woman. And then again, this forest, she went to the forest, and then she went and there was someone else in there, and they swapped genders. Which so there is things like that where it's actually a woman going into a male. I mean, it's interesting because when I was doing my research, kind of the pronouns to do with these different deities, it was, it was easier to just stick with the gender that they started off as. It was so kind of relaying these back. It's if I'm shortening these things, I can't keep changing from one to the other.
Difficult.
Yeah, but the one that I've always, the religion that I've always been fascinated with, and I always go back to, and I'm always learning about the offshoots of, is religions that are based in Latin America and the Caribbean. So in Santeria, there's the tale of Logan Eddy or Ede, who had traits of both parents and lived on and off in a male role for so long, then a female role. And when they were found out, they were kind of, they were outed and shamed. But I mean, Santeria in general is seen as quite a very welcoming religion, regardless of gender and sexuality. But so some people who are trans, gender non-conforming, see this tale as very like gender affirming. But then because of the shame and the outing, then some people in Santeria see that as confirmation of this is a bad thing, So I find that quite interesting how, it can be perceived in different ways. But in voodoo, Baron Samedi, who is a figure that I absolutely adore. He's the Haitian lower of the dead, who's between worlds, and he's a party boy, he's a reveler, he's debauched, he's obscene, he tells filthy jokes, he kind of is irreverent about death. He helps the sick, and he helps people go into the afterworld. And because of his kind of party boy, kind of persona, he cross dresses, he's very flirty, so he's bisexual. There's a lot I'll go into to do with voodoo and things to do with kind of gender fluidity in general in their practice. There's another lower who are under Azuli, who are feminine class of the lower, and Azuli Dantor is like a protector of women, protector of effeminate men, and is seen as the patroness of lesbians. There's a lot I could go into about the voodoo stuff, but then that kind of leads into there's a lot of sexually fluid gods as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
but again, it's kind of when it comes to ancient religions, again, we're kind of putting our terms and definitions when those definitions did not exist. It was just, how it was.
Yeah, I think looking back even from sort of a lot of the traditional witchcraft and traditional sort of histories that I very much have come through from, the line that I've heard said a couple of times is the old gods were just horny,
Yeah.
and it didn't they didn't care
Yeah.
who they were horny with, and that's been used almost as a throwaway line to say that everybody was capable of sexual relations with anybody. And it's interesting how, as the world becomes more and more puritanical, as we kind of go back into almost Christian viewpoint being laid upon everything, and how that whitewashes and almost sanctifies a lot of history. It feels like we're kind of in that sort of space again, where as people are discovering more and more about how deities and how religious practices were done in the past, how all of a sudden there's that overlay that gets put on it now of these are perverse gods, these are, it's like the satanic panic days again, where it's like it's more and more being viewed as, these things were done, but they were done because people at the time didn't know any better and all of that.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, because same-sex relations happen in nature, because they happen in man, because they happen in animal kingdom, they would obviously happen within the gods, and some gods would be free and open with their sexuality, and some gods would choose not to be.
Yeah.
And that was just how the old gods were. They were horny. And I love the fact that in all of your research, it's the same thing. And when we look at the psychology behind why we create deities and why we respond differently to different deities, and different, gods speak to us in different ways, just the fact that, there were deities that were as horny, as sexual, as gender fluid, as sexuality fluid as the humans that were worshipping them at the time. I think that sort of, you uncovering more and more about that through all of these other cultures going back into antiquity and beyond, I think it's really interesting that correlation is still there. And it's like, well, actually, as a species, the human beings have always been horny and open and fluid. It's just the societal rules and the norms that we live our lives by that kind of stamp all this on top of it, and then assign, positive and negative connotations to it. But I think it's fascinating.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, we kind of see this as a more liberated time when these terms didn't exist. But, kind of in ancient cultures, and especially in Norse mythology, there is the viewpoint back then that a gay man who's a top is seen as strong and masculine, whereas a bottom is seen as weak and effeminate. And, I think in the Norse, it was, there were trials to do with it, kind of challenging you if you were seen as, if you were a bottom, basically. And that, kind of in Greek mythology as well, it was, people were seen as, if they were bottoms, then that was seen as a bad thing. So
from my experience, volunteering and working with sexual health charities, we know that there are prison visitors that will go in and provide sexual health care to inmates. And we know historically that some of that same, well, not the same information, but there was still a need for that within other same-sex environments, such as during World War II, World War I, large military combats where large amounts of men are in close-knit communities where their lives are at risk. We know that same-sex relationships had formed. Unfortunately, the reality is, both during the two big wars, and within the prison populace, it isn't something that is ever really spoken about when you come out of that. So for soldiers that came away from war, they may have had a person that they were incredibly close to, that they slept with day in, day out, that they formed bonds and relationships with whilst they were in those situations. But when that war was over, they never spoke of it. And it's the same within the prison population. There are a lot of accounts given from people who were inmates who, when they've left prison, never, ever, ever spoke of the fact publicly with their family, with their friends, the fact that they were in these same-sex relationships. And unfortunately, when you have that secrecy in those sort of environments, that's a surefire way for sexual health issues to come up, which is largely how I know about some of these stories, because it was through people that were accessing sexual health care, and them sharing and opening up about their experiences. But it is really interesting that within a lot of cultures, even today, this is still something that we see, and it's to my mind, it makes a mockery of everybody putting a fundamentalist view on sexuality, because if that's still happening behind closed doors today and always has, then how is it something that you can police? How is it something that you can write a law against? You know what I mean? It's human nature, for God's sake. It's the nature. It's part of life.
I mean, in the Greek mythology, just it's a gay soap opera. Like, I was reading about there was a list online about who's had a relationship with who, and all the men were just linked, like it was Zeus and Ganymede, and then it was Ganymede and Minos, and then it was Minos and Theseus. Like, and it was just, and everyone was having Apollo. Apollo was just,
from what we know of Apollo, when we look at statues and sort of art from the time or after the time, but you know what I mean, it's like Apollo is quite chiseled, so you kind of get the impression that even if the deities weren't flexy sexy, Apollo walks in and you go, oh, why not? If I was ever going to do it, I'll do it with Apollo. And afterwards, everyone's going, you added? Oh, you want to try? Oh, he's good. Oh, he's good. He's good. He's good. Yeah, he's good. It's that one. Sort you right out, Apollo will.
But the thing is, like, all these men that are, kind of linked, I couldn't find any lesbian pairings apart from, I think it was Artemis and Callisto. It's kind of hinted at. Like, there wasn't any female pairings. And that's what I found in a lot of ancient history and mythology and things like that, where there isn't any lesbian rep, because back then it wasn't seen as a big deal. No. Because it was almost like, well, there's no penis involved, so if my wife wants to go off with this woman,
she ain't going to get pregnant.
Yeah, so it was.
She's not going to end up carrying some other man's child, so therefore, why do I care? But again, it's also, don't forget, Neil, that a lot of this history is filtered through post-Victorian, study, because obviously Queen Victoria, the reason that homosexuality was banned for men was that Queen Victoria could not in any way, shape or form fathom what two women would do together. So she just couldn't imagine it. So because she couldn't imagine it, lesbianism has never been illegal in the UK. So because of that, when you've got all of these researchers post-Victorian, during the Victorian era, where they are starting to look at these myths and starting to translate things, there could have been massive lesbian orgies happening all the time among the gods. There could be realms and realms of documented evidence proving that they were all lesbian at the time, but because they had to present their information through various guilds that Victoria would eventually know about, you can just see them getting the equivalent of a black Sharpie and just go, nope, can't tell her that, can't tell Victoria that, nope, we'll take all of that out. So, but we've got Sappho's, so very famous.
But I think, I mean, like you say, it's obviously been filtered down through men, really, because there's kind of, with Athena, she's seen as, because she never took an interest in any relationships, and because she was a warrior, and because she dressed in men's armor, and kind of men have interpreted that as, oh, she must have been asexual, or she must have been lesbian, but again, it's just people's interpretations, basically. I think through doing all this research, kind of looking into, well, how do queer people see that? What's their take on that? How do they incorporate that into their practice? And again, it goes back to always finding that the Afro-Caribbean and Latin American religions are quite open for a variety of different reasons. I mean, Santa Muerte is, I think, is the most accepting one, because Santa Muerte in Latin America communities, it can be practiced by anyone. Like she's open to anyone because death doesn't discriminate. So you have queer people, you have criminals, you have sex workers. She just doesn't discriminate. I mean, there was a book that I've still got to read by Tomas Prower about Santa Muerte, and he's a gay man, so I'm interested in how he's got into that practice as a gay man. I'm quite interested in his standpoint. But in voodoo, because of the fluidity of sexuality in the gods as well, that's always not been a big deal. Like it's if you're being horsed in voodoo, I mean, it seems to be that women and gay men would be horsed by the female gods, the female spirit, sorry.
What's being horsed?
Being possessed.
Oh, okay.
So when you're a horseman, a horsewoman, then you're invoking the spirit into you, and then will act in those ceremonies as that god, kind of,
okay,
that kind of thing. So yeah, but I mean, this is the thing, like, kind of going back to all those different ancient cultures and just culture in general, is that to change gender or to cross-dress was seen as a more accepted practice or life choice style, whatever, than being homosexual or bisexual. It was almost seen as like, well, okay, well, if you change into a woman, that's okay for you to be with a man, in general. But I mean, Santa Muerte is, I find it so fascinating. I have so many books because I just find it really fascinating. I'm kind of getting into, I never know how to say it, candomblé, which is another aspect of voodoo. Like Santeria has also kind of got elements as well to do with acceptance for queer people. But candomblé, I find it really fascinating because they have, in general, I think in Santeria as well, they have houses. They're kind of, kind of people who get accepted into the house. They all practice together as a community. But with that particular faction of Santeria, they almost, it mirrors drag houses. So it will be like a mother who will accept someone as their child and accept it into their practice. And some of the rituals kind of mirror drag culture, in that when they're possessed by a spirit, they will read the room like drag queens, and it becomes like a fun activity of, like, this god, this spirit coming and kind of reading you to filth, kind of giving you insight into your life, and kind of, but doing it in a very funny way. There's a drag queen, famous drag queen called Aja, and she was on Drag Race. I mean, she is on Drag Race at the moment on All Stars. And she's always been very open about practicing Santeria. And when her cast was announced in the original season, it had kind of interviews with each drag queen, and it showed her in her house doing some of her Santeria practices, and she's always brought that into her drag, you know, kind of the outfits that she does are influenced by her religion, and I find that super cool and super fascinating, you know. But I think with going back to Santeria, like, because a lot of the outcasts from the Catholic Church, so say queer people, will go to Santa Muerte because there is Catholic elements
It's
to it.
similar.
So
Yeah, it's
so it
similar.
is a kind of alternative where you can read into her as a certain saint, or some of the kind of rituals kind of mirror that. And yeah.
It is fascinating. I have to mention my girl Jinx
Oh yes,
Monsoon,
Jinx.
who is very openly a witch, describes herself as a witch, and has done many interviews, and is just an incredible human being, and very publicly from day one a witch, and a drag star, and a trans woman now as she's transitioning,
Yeah.
and just an amazing icon for the queer and magical communities. So yeah, I have to any mention of Drag Race,
she's wonderful. I love Jinx.
we have to mention
Yeah, I love
Jinx.
her. I was reading about Eastern Siberian shamanism, where they have a tribe within them called the Chukchi. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Who were known, who are or were known as soft men, who would dress as women or present feminine, and lived as women. And in that community, they're feared because they're seen as more powerful, more spiritual, more divine. And you know, the Eastern Siberian shamans are, you know, they oh, you don't want to cross them. You know, they've got super special, you know, stuff. And then, but I think the Chukchi in general, they raise children without gender. They kind of let them come to their own decisions, I think. But the thing is with like shamanism and also Native American is that there are so many tribes that obviously it's going to vary from tribe to tribe. There might be some that have very rigid ideas, binary, regarding gender. I mean, I went down like a road like some years ago about Native American spirituality, and it's massive because all the tribes are completely different. Like they have so many different practices and ideas and the way that they look at things. And but obviously, you know, as we know, like there is the concept of two spirit, which is hard to define because it's mainly a term for outsiders to just kind of simplify things, where in Native American culture it's far more nuanced and it varies their definitions by tribe as well.
Yeah, very much.
And it's kind of, I think there's a danger of that we romanticize it, because in some tribes it's wow, it's a wonderful concept, you know. It's this idea of embodying both male and female energy and seeing that's been seen as a divine thing. But then some tribes are very binary and very exclusionary, so they might see a feminine man as like, oh well, you belong in the women, like doesn't matter, you belong in the women, you know. So
it's also something that certainly within the wider trans community I have seen. Probably 10-15 years ago there was a sudden trend of people claiming oh well, I'm two spirit because, you know, it means the same thing as trans. I'm two spirit. And it's like, no, you're white, therefore you cannot by definition use that label. It is very much, not only is it only a label used by or used to describe Native American people, it isn't even universally used among Native American people. It is some tribes have this terminology in this particular way. Other tribes view it very differently, as you're saying. And actually, it isn't for everybody to use that terminology because you're not using it in the right way. And as a white outsider, you can never use it in the right way because you haven't got all of that context. And arguably, this is one of those other things that is a closed culture. It is a closed practice. And I know that recently, certainly within the last couple of years, that's very much been stepped back from. Interestingly, when I was looking at various Pride flags and things for something else that I was doing for Pride, the trans flag, which is this one here and on my t-shirt, I've seen that with a 2-feather design, and I believe it's got a dream catcher on. I'll stick a picture up on screen, and that is seen as the two-spirit flag. For a brief cultural moment, almost anybody that was in the trans community was like, oh well, I'm going to take this new label, and it was like, yeah, you're about as Native American as I am, so let's not claim that.
I mean, that's it. It's there's so much nuance, and within each tribe there is their own term for two-spirit, and in some tribes it's they have different sets of genders, like written here, like terrible, sorry with names, Dine or Dine, they have 4 genders. In Cree there's 8. In Zuni they have a particular 3rd gender. So within that classification there are other classifications, and they might not fit our outsider term, or we're projecting our definitions onto that culture, which I think is fucked up. It's because
it's exactly the same way as projecting our 21st century culture on pantheons of yore. It doesn't fit. We can't do it.
And I think obviously there was a big shift when the Christians came and they forced their perspectives on Native Americans, and that influenced their thinking about it. And so it's just a very, very interesting and very complex subject that I don't think we can't understand it, but it's interesting though. So it's one of those things where if you are Native American, then please correct me, or please educate me about my British way of looking at these things. But it's interesting. Another really fascinating thing that I found when I was doing my research, I kept finding them, was gay creation myths. Like there's different religions, ancient religions, that have their own gay creation myths, where they believe some event or a relationship created gayness, which I
I was going to say, which way round is this creation myth? Are you talking about the creation of the universe created by gay people, or when gay was created, when homosexuality was created? That's okay.
In Greek, I feel like I kind of learned about this in my first tarot deck was based on the Greek myths, and the world is represented by one set of humans. Apparently there was 3 sets of humans originally. They were both 2 men back to back, 2 women back to back, and a man and a woman back to back. Zeus thought they were too powerful, so he cut them all in half with a thunderbolt. And that's the idea that we're looking for our other halves. So there you've got two men, two women, a man and a woman. So that kind of says, well, that's where gays started. They're always looking for their other half. People are looking for that physical connection.
There is an amazing version of that story in the musical and in the film Hedwig and the Angry Inch. It is an amazing, there is a whole song within that musical dedicated to that. And in the film, it's animated, and it is absolutely amazing. Really, really, really good, because again, you're in your interpretation there, you're talking about it as a gay creation myth. It's also used a lot by members of the trans community who recognize that perhaps that's where we come from. If as a trans woman who spent some of my life presenting this way, and now I'm presenting this way, it's kind of like, that ideal of reuniting those two halves, whereas some people see that story as being about attraction, and once you've separated these two sides, you're looking to find your other people have taken that story to see that's your other self.
That's what I like about all this, is that you can look at it in a different way. In Santeria, there's a story about a batter and inlay, don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, who were two brothers who were cast out of their family and were made blind and deaf, I believe, and were cast out into the bottom of the sea randomly, and they couldn't communicate with each other in those ways, but they found a way to communicate to each other in a more, I don't know, more spiritual way, and their love apparently just caused gay to happen, I guess. But it's seen as quite a poignant tale for gay people, because it's about how obviously gay people being silenced, people not being outcast. So kind of in Santeria, that's seen as like quite a resonant kind of tale, I found. And I kind of keep finding these stories. I mean, as I kind of go down, Mayan and Aztecs and Sumerian, I think it was Mayan, there was a demon called Chin, which is quite a strange word, whose axe apparently created homosexual love. I couldn't quite find out what axe in general, but it was in the Mayans, like homosexual acts were seen as like quite magical, and there were kind of gay sex in temples apparently, and so I always find that really, really cool, the idea of gay sex being magical acts, but I could go on and on. I just found so much, and even like up until today, I was still there just getting books out, reading, cross checking things on the internet.
It's almost at a point, Neil, where you need to start writing a book yourself about this. But it is very much, I think the more you uncover, the more that leads to something else, and then that leads to something else, and before you know it, you are very much down that rabbit hole. So with all of the reading and research and everything else that you've done, what resources would you recommend for people to go and discover a lot of these stories yourself, because you've only just touched on little snippets of the stories today? I can see a lot of the interesting titles you've got there on the shelf.
So I think the most helpful, I would recommend this to everyone, is Queer Magick, which is written by a gay man, and he talks about how queer cultures and spiritual cultures intersect, and basically all the kind of stuff that I've just kind of talked about is the kind of thing that is in this. It's just a more kind of historical, anthropological, mythological kind of telling of cultures throughout time, how these things intersect, you know, sort of deities and mythology and practices. Like, you know, it's not like a practical witchcraft book. It's just a fantastic thing. And, you know, even when I was reading this, I would go and find out more, or kind of cross-check it and go, oh, right, well, he believed that, and this person believed that. So, you know, it's a fascinating book. I would, you know, it's really thought-provoking, and will get you thinking about, oh, well, I'll read more about that. And that's a fantastic one. But I mean, I've said during Pride Month that I've been kind of looking into kind of gay witchcraft books in general, you know. I'm actually still getting through Gay Witchcraft, which is quite a classic, by Christopher Penczak. I never know how to say his name. He writes some fantastic books in general anyway. He's a gay man. And this is just kind of how he married his witchcraft practice into being gay. And he kind of goes into some of the deities and practices and ways of looking at kind of spiritual things from that point of view. So I kind of went to this, you know, the sections in the book about these things. So I've compared them to other things, and that's really good. I mean, it's very dated. I'll say that, but it's very unapologetically gay, which I absolutely adore about it. Because I mean, this is from like 2000, 2001. But I mean, I'd said about how I was reading this and reading this one, Queering Your Craft by Cassandra Snow. And this was released, I can't remember, like only a few years ago. And I wanted to see how these two books compared in relation to perspectives on witchcraft practice. And they were both in, you know, I've read the whole of this one. But I'd say if you were sort of starting out in witchcraft and you're queer, then this is a really good one. I mean, it wasn't for me because it covers a lot of ground that I'm very familiar with, you know, but as a voice, it was good reading their book. They're non-binary lesbian. So, you know, that's another perspective than a gay man. So I would, I mean, Gay Witchcraft is he started out from a very Wiccan perspective. So, you know, there's a lot in here that I'm kind of getting through I'm like, not for me, but for the time period, you know, it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
But I mean, the difference is, because I mean, I said this is quite dated in terms of, you know, this is from early 2000s, you know, like terms have changed, you know, so there's some that you wouldn't see as sensitive now, but he has acknowledged that these terms are going to change. So that was a great thing to read in this book. He just said, I'm sorry, but, you know, and I think he's done a recent update to this as well, and, you know, his kind of perspectives have changed. And whereas Queering Your Craft is inclusive of absolutely everyone, you know, they think of absolutely every letter, you know. But to me, I mean, I find this in other kind of queer witchcraft books that I've read, is that sometimes I find that a bit jarring, and I don't know whether or not it's because I'm in my mid-40s and I'm bisexual that I don't need terms kind of explained to me anymore, or you know, it's strange because I feel like whenever I have read books that are kind of from a queer perspective, I kind of think, well, if you're a queer person, you know about this, you kind of think like that anyway. You kind of whereas Gay Witchcraft, from the time. Like, I feel like it just goes in, you know, like it doesn't kind of go like, oh, as a gay man or anything like that. So I don't know. I think I'm just jaded, I think, or something. But it's I just kind of wonder sometimes. Like, I know some people have obviously been very inclusive and they want to explain things in a certain way, but sometimes I find that a bit kind of, get on to the witchcraft, please. So
Yeah.
So basically, if you're starting out, Queering Your Craft, I recommend that. You know, they cover a lot of ground. You know, different elements of witchcraft in general, and gay witchcraft I'd recommend just because it's a point in time. That book, it's really good. I really appreciate it. You know, there's pictures of half naked men in there and doing witchcraft, and you know, so if you're into that, so.
Sort of offsets the old the Faroes books from back in the day with their boobs and minge everywhere.
Oh yeah, and I think, I mean, it's interesting because they both have spells in them, they both have rituals in them, and they're very telling of the time. Like, there are some that are very similar, like say maybe a protection ritual for, I don't know, like against homophobia, or to find a partner, or there's very similar kind of things, obviously, that kind of show you that we're still striving for those things, you know, that's what we want to manifest. Whereas in Snow's book and some of the other queer witchcraft books I've read, they're very political in the kind of rituals that they're mentioning, and also just in general. And I personally find that quite off-putting, just because there has been some that we have both read where we've like, pack it in. So,
yeah,
but I understand the importance in that, but
it's how it's done, though, isn't it? It's how it's done. I do think I was going to say former, but I don't think I am a former. The activist in me, she says, festooned in rainbow and trans tats, you know, still going to my local Costa every single week to go, excuse me, where are this year's Pride Cups, please? You know, the part of me that is planning on going to many Pride events in the next few months, not to go and enjoy them, but to go and be a visible trans person. You know, I'm actually now thinking I need to read Queering the Craft. By the way, if anybody wants to get in touch with us, you can do. Just send an email to podcast@beyondauthentic.co.uk. That will come through if you've got any questions, or if you've got any recommendations, or if there's any information that you desperately want us to correct in a future video, you can do that there as well. As the learned researcher of the podcast, obviously Neil is the one that's able to recommend books and everything else. As the tarot one, I do have some incredibly interesting and inclusive decks. Now, some of these I have talked about before. I think a couple of these I've talked about before, but these are decks that I absolutely love using on my live streams every Sunday and Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. on the channel. I use these if I'm out and about doing tarot readings. They are very inclusive, and I love the fact that they are unapologetically so. So I'm going to go kind of in reverse order, I guess. I've got the Rainbow Tarot, which is from Chronicle Books, and let me just see if there's an author's name on here. Yes, it is a art and concept by So Ladzo and guidebook by Siri Jarrell Johnson. So I totally recommend this. It's very, unfortunately, it's not quite as bright and colourful as that on the actual cards, as you can see, but they are an interesting interpretation of the Rider-Waite-Smith, and they are very queer focused. So I recommend that. It is very open and diverse. It's, if you know, you know, but it isn't sort of festooned with gay, queer.
Yeah.
Unlike the Queer Tarot, which is unapologetically what it says on the tin. This does come in a much larger box with the guidebook, but the cards themselves, these live permanently on my desk now. Very much bright and colourful rainbow deck with, again, very bright and colourful imagery. This person, I mean, just happens to have purple hair, which, alas, I'm no longer able to do. But again, the depictions in here are very queer across the board. So we've got, for example, the Six of Swords. Oops, there we go. So we've got the Six of Swords, which historically would show a family on the boat, and this just happens to be all female-bodied sort of characters. Read into that whatever interpretation of family you choose to. I love it. There are trans people. There are, you know, this image, which is the Emperor. I don't know whether you can see, but this Emperor has a wee little scar just here. If you know, you know. It's a top surgery scar, and it's just, again, a lovely, bright, colourful deck. This is a little bit more in your face queer, because obviously it's called the Queer Tarot. So totally recommend that. Again, this one, I've got no idea who published this because I haven't got the big book is away in a box. Then you've got two of my most commonly used decks. We've got the Unfolding Path Tarot by Athene Noctua, and it says here this 78 card tarot deck featuring beautifully reimagined archetypes and modern diverse characters will guide you as you explore the infinite paths your life can take. Again, based on the Rider-Waite-Smith, Pamela Colin-Smith sort of archetypal tarot decks, really. Again, lovely artwork on the back. It's very soft watercolory. It's a very delicate sort of deck. But again, we've got the Ten of Cups, historically a card of celebrating with families. And once again, we've got two women and two young girls celebrating together. Are they wearing, you know, lesbian pride flags, bother boots, you know, pink triangle badges, all of that? No. Is it there if you know it's there? Yes. And this is one of the reasons why, again, I like this deck. We've got different races, different peoples, just lots of interpretations of the cards. It's beautifully done. And we do have a pregnant empress, which is one of my slight bugbears. But, you know, it is, again, a quite a diverse and very, very LGBTQ friendly deck. It really is. There's a lot of that sort of iconography in here. And then, of course, my most used, my most talked about deck, the deck you'll see 9 times out of 10 on any of my live streams when I'm reading, the Fifth Spirit Tarot deck. I have recommended this so many times. It is such a wonderful deck, incredibly diverse in terms of body types, gender identities, abilities, across the board, different races, different interpretations of the cards. Absolutely stunning. This is by Charlie Claire Burgess from Hay House. This is one of those decks that I can see myself. The box itself is starting to get a little bit dogged. The cards, as I show you them, you can see the little bits of markings and, you know, nicks and almost little nibbles around the design over the years. And you can see they are now looking a wee bit grubby from just being used almost every day. I can see myself buying a backup copy of this or two to have so that I never run out. But again, you can see here very standard depictions of the tarot cards, and this Justice just happens to be a woman of color, a very strong looking woman of color. Is this woman a trans woman? Who knows? Is this woman just a physically strong butch woman? Who knows? It's never sort of, in this case, expressly mentioned. She's just, you know, Our Lady Justice. We've got cards that represent the knight, historically aimed at men. This is somebody who is perhaps female bodied or has a female presentation. We've got a Page of Cups who just happens to be in a wheelchair. Does the wheelchair have any relevance to this particular card being the Page of Cups? No, it's just somebody who happens to be in a wheelchair. Absolutely love all of that. This Empress, wonderful depiction of the Empress with all of her abundance, all of her femininity, her crown, and an Adam's apple. You know, this deck just is everything for me that I want from a deck that reflects real life, and the great, wonderful diversity in it. It also has one of the most interesting, in-depth and thought-provoking lovers cards I've ever seen, which basically shows the depiction of the main character here and their own shadow self. So this could represent another person in the way that the lovers does, a relationship with somebody else, but more importantly, this is a relationship with the shadow self. This is really looking deeply into the subconscious, into the shadow, into all of that, which as a liminal witch fascinates me, as somebody who has looked into quite a bit about psychology and our understanding of self. I think the card is incredible. And again, it's a deck which it has lots of all of that symbolism throughout it, but I would argue, again, unless it's something that you are actively looking for, it's not necessarily rainbow festooned, trans flag festooned. It's not something that is going to necessarily ring those alarm bells. I will say, I think it's the Emperor card in this deck that has a naked breast that isn't what people would understand or think of as a male-bodied breast. It is very much a female-bodied breast. What does that mean for that particular Emperor card? It's down to everyone else's interpretation. But I do think it is a wonderfully diverse and inclusive deck, and something which all of these decks I recommend. There's also the Star Spinner deck, which has, I think, 4 or 5 different lovers cards with different embodiments of people. So if you are perhaps a gay man and you want your lovers card to represent 2 male figures, that's on the card. There's a lesbian version. There's a version where the 2 people are of indeterminate gender, so perhaps for non-binary folk or for trans folk. And there is a very distinctly different male and female card in that deck. So even straight people are represented because, you know, we don't want to leave our straight brethren behind. And then finally, I will mention this deck, which Neil actually bought for me, I believe for Christmas. I can't remember, Christmas or birthday gift. It was a gift. And it is the Missing Witches deck of oracles, feminist ancestor magic for meditations, divination, and spell work. It works as an oracle deck. It works as if you want to particularly find a particular person from this deck and have it as a symbol on your altar or something to, you know, create a spell around. But it's also an incredible deck looking at some of the feminist, but also LGBTQ, although again, it isn't necessarily aimed at that, but some of those people through history that we have perhaps allowed to be placed under those Christian mainstream rocks that I talked about earlier. And this has got some really interesting stories. And it's almost like, did you know this about this person? Oh, that's really interesting. Now go and read a book, go and see their history, go and seek them out. Including some really interesting bits about the person that I've mentioned, and who is arguably one of the most important people in modern tarot, which is Pamela Coleman Smith, otherwise known as Pixie, who you know, was the artist behind the original Rider-Waite-Smith or Rider-Waite deck as it was known. And she's one of the characters depicted in this oracle deck. And so, yeah, this is by North Atlantic Books, and the authors are Reza Dickens and Amy Torrick. 100% recommend getting your hands on this, both as an interesting educational tool, but also as an oracle deck, and also as an interesting piece of history from our community. So yeah, those are 100% my recommendations. No doubt there are modern decks coming out all the time with lots of diversity and inclusiveness, and I do try and keep on top of some of those. But I've got to say, when I've got a deck that's as wonderful as the Fifth Spirit, sometimes I do kind of think, well, this deck is like, I don't believe in soul decks as such, but this deck is as important to me now as the Connolly deck was for 18 years when I didn't own a second deck. And this is kind of up there for me as well, as like, I can see, put it this way, if I was to pass away in the next 10 years, a version of this deck is going in the coffin with me, put it that way. So yeah, those would be my recommendations.
Yeah, I think it's difficult with book recommendations because obviously, you know, if I was going to recommend a book of witchcraft to someone who is one of the letters, you've got to kind of marry their witchcraft practice and their identity. So it's very difficult kind of matching these things up. That's why I just kind of said Queering Your Craft is like a introduction, really, basically.
Yeah. Obviously, I've talked there about Pamela Coleman Smith and some of the missing witches from the deck of oracles, but there's a lot of other magical practitioners that are again placed under some of those rocks by wider, more mainstream society, even within the witchcraft community. So there must be more than just the people we've mentioned, Neil, that would come under the sort of queer icon or queer witchy icon status. I mean, do you know of anybody else that we should be remembering?
Yeah, because I mean, when at the end of all this kind of research about ancient stuff and cultures, and then I kind of went, hang on, there is like queer occultists, you know. I mean, because obviously some of the authors I've mentioned are queer, and when I kind of went, oh, hang on, let me just kind of look at these other authors, and Phil Hine, who wrote Condensed Chaos, which is always the one that I taught. You know, I say if you've got an interest in it, he's bisexual. There's, I mean, you mentioned about Scott Cunningham. He was openly gay. Then when we were doing the book recommendations, I'd mentioned Genesis Peorage, who was into chaos magic, and they
is also in here.
Yeah, also in there. Also started their own magical order, Temple of Psychic Youth, and lived their life in a very interesting way that expressed their gender in a whole, well, their own concept. You know, they lived their life like that whilst incorporating chaos magic into their musical performances. You know, super fascinating person. When I was thinking about going down, well, what about the chaos queers, you know, finding out that Phil Hine was bisexual, that was interesting. And Genesis, but then I went, oh, William S. Burroughs, identified as a homosexual man, who was obviously famous writer, and he was very much into the occult and very open about his magical practices, which were very experimental. Super interesting if you go down that rabbit hole of William S. Burroughs and his occult practice. Famous for doing the cut-up technique, which is a big chaos magic thing. Also, he became a member of the IoT as well later in his life. You know, so that's really cool. And I mentioned Grant Morrison, who's a chaos magician, famous for doing the hyper sigil in their comic. And to get the Invisibles, when the Invisibles wasn't selling as well as it did, they got all the fans to do a masturbation sigil to like keep the comic going, which is, you know, quite interesting. So as a non-binary chaos magician, I found that interesting. I mean, there's obviously the infamous Aleister Crowley, who was bisexual and incorporated, his bisexuality into his magic. Finding it difficult, though, to find any lesbian occultists. I've found there were some bisexual ones. Rosalie Norton. I've got a book to read about her up there, who was a famous occultist artist in Australia, I think. I think she was called the Witch of King's Cross.
Oh no, that rings a bell. Yes.
Yeah, that was her. Really interesting reading about her. I saw some of her artwork in London. She was openly bisexual. I mean, the thing is, there is some people who are rumored, a bit like kind of Pamela, where it's kind of like, were they? There was some, but I'm kind of keeping my eye out for the bisexual lesbian occultists. There's plenty of the men out there, but yeah, I'm always interested. It was just one of those things where I was like, hang on, I haven't actually thought about the living human beings out there, that are doing magic and being a letter. So yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, again, if you have listened all this way and you know of any other LGBTQIA plus occultists, characters that we should be at least recognizing, either on a specific Pride podcast or, whenever, just in general as being part of our wonderful community, then please do let us know. And again, leave comments underneath. You can, as I say, you can always email podcast@beyondauthentic.co.uk. We would be fascinated to discover new people, and obviously for Neil, who likes these deep dives, it would probably give you a few other jumping off points for more research tasks,
especially
get in touch.
Especially when it comes to obviously all the things I've talked about to do with mythology and deities and stuff. I'm interested if anyone's got any corrections about things, or they actually went, oh well, you didn't mention this, or well, have you heard about this, or just let us know in the comments, because I love learning. I don't mind being corrected. Tell me things so I can spend hours into the wee hours just looking up all these things, and you never know, there might be another podcast episode that comes out of it.
Absolutely. For now, though, I will close this month's episode by saying that, all things being well, we will be back with another one next month, hopefully. This is a bit of an ad hoc podcast series, but with my Swiss cheesed brain and your chaos mage life, I don't think anybody would expect a regular standard monthly upload schedule from us. It's just never going to happen in reality, is it? Unfortunately, as we're filming this, it's already quite almost towards the end of June. And my intention was to have both of these episodes recorded and up by the middle of June. But again, my health unfortunately put a kibosh onto that. But we will, in fact, be back very soon. To be notified about more episodes, you can always do the things by liking the episode here and subscribing to the channel. Why not? Go ahead and make sure, though, when you do subscribe, that you dong your bell and that you change your settings to all. YouTube at the moment is having all sorts of wibbles and wobbles, and people are being unsubscribed left, right and center. They've set it to all and then they're getting no notifications. So that is the only way currently that we have for letting you all know when new episodes are dropping, but also when I do the other things on the channel. So first of all, as a close, I want to say a huge, massive, whopping, great big thank you to Neil. How you manage to keep all this in your head is absolutely bonkers. I know you've got copious notes in front of you.
Yeah.
But I, as somebody who struggles with the most common of names and pronunciations, even on the even on the YouTube streams, when I've got their name of the person in front of me, I still struggle with pronunciations. I think you've done incredibly well today. So thank you very much for doing the hard work with this one, doing all of the research.
I love it.
And
I really love it.
Yeah, but again, remember what I said earlier. In your comments, please do be kind. Remember that these are not necessarily cultures and dialogues that we are used to speaking. So if there is a correction around pronunciation and things like that, do be kind. But I hope that you've enjoyed these episodes. We've certainly enjoyed filming them. And I've got to say, at this point, looking at the clock, I think there's about, in total of the 2 episodes, there's about 4.5 to 5 hours worth of content that I'm going to have to whittle down into a more manageable form. But from us, I've got to say a huge whopping thank you to you for watching and listening. And as we always say, keep practicing.
Keep experimenting.
And we will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye.